Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer on the Pivot's PIO EIA Day 1 training. Today, we're diving deep into the rigorous standards of modern environmental compliance and data validation. Now, if you're in environmental consulting, you already know the landscape has completely shifted. Just piling up data? Yeah, that's not going to cut it for project clearance anymore. The stakes are sky high, the scrutiny is intense, and honestly, failure means massive project delays. So in this masterclass explainer, we're unpacking the exact Day 1 curriculum of the Pivot training program to show you how to transform a vulnerable draft report into a rock-solid, scientifically defensible environmental impact assessment that can survive the absolute toughest regulatory reviews.
So, let's open our forensic investigation with the big one, the most critical question. Why do so many environmental impact assessments face total rejection from NABET assessors? It's a really painful reality. You spend months collecting data, drop thousands of dollars on lab analysis, put in hundreds of man-hours drafting this massive document, only for the expert appraisal committee to just tear it apart. Why? Is it totally fabricated data? Well, sometimes, sure, but more often than not, it's something much more subtle.
Actually, a recent NABET assessor hit the nail on the head. They pointed out that the true strength of an EIA report isn't just in presenting monitoring data, but in interpreting it. Think about it. Monitoring data alone is not an EIA. You've got to explain the why. Why are we seeing these specific values? What's their environmental significance? How are humans contributing? If your report just throws a giant pile of tables at the reviewer without telling the story behind those numbers, no way, it's getting rejected. It all comes down to professional scientific judgment, not just glorified data entry.
To really understand how we got to today's hyper-strict regulatory demands, let's take a quick look back at the history of the EIA framework. The global journey actually kicked off in 1969 with the U.S. National Environmental Policy Act. Over in India, things started a bit more informally around 1978. But the real game changer? That was 1994. When the first formal EIA notification made environmental clearance legally mandatory. Fast forward to 2006, and we get the current decentralized notification. This was huge because it shifted a massive amount of appraisal responsibility straight to the state level and demanded highly structured public consultations. So we've basically evolved from basic procedural box checking to demanding substantive, scientifically validated outcomes. Okay, here's our agenda for the Day 1 Masterclass curriculum. First, we'll look at modern environmental impact assessment. Second, primary data validation. Third, secondary data validation. And fourth, practical checklists.
Right, let's get into Session 1, Modern Environmental Impact Assessment.
So, a modern EIA, it requires a highly coordinated orchestra of specialists. NABET demands a very strict division of labor across three main pillars. First up, you have the EIA coordinator, or EC. They act as the project leader, making sure the whole narrative is consistent. Then you've got the functional area experts, the FAEs. They're basically your specialized domain detectives for things like air, water, ecology, and socioeconomics, stepping in to interpret data and design mitigation plans. And finally, the NABET accredited laboratory. They're the ones ensuring analytical data integrity. Because honestly, if the lab fails, the entire foundation of your EIA totally collapses.
Now, when you're building this report, your project description has to be flawlessly consistent across all chapters, all forms, and all layout plans. We're talking exactly as dictated by regulatory appendices. For example, if Chapter 1 says the project area is 55 hectares, but your water balance chapter somehow implies a footprint of 60 hectares, yeah, an AI-enhanced review or a sharp EAC member is going to catch that instantly. Consistency in coordinates, production capacity, resource requirements, it's not just about good formatting, it's literally a fundamental legal requirement for environmental clearance.
Moving right along to Session 2, Primary Data Validation.
Listen, primary data is the heartbeat of your baseline study. It's the air you sampled, the water you tested. If this fails quality control, your whole report is completely at risk, so you absolutely have to follow these 4 investigative steps. First, field verification. Making sure GPS coordinates actually match and your samplers are calibrated. Second, laboratory verification to ensure they're using standard analytical methods. Third, scientific interpretation. Do these numbers even make sense for this specific geography? And fourth, anomaly investigation. Look, if you find a massive spike in particulate matter, you can't just average it out. You have to investigate it, document the surrounding conditions, and properly justify how you're treating that data.
Crucial to that lab verification are strict QA/QC protocols, mainly to hunt for contamination. So a lab must have valid NABL accreditation specifically for the parameters they're testing.
We're looking closely at blanks here. If a field or lab blank shows contamination, well, your actual samples are totally compromised. We also cross-verify precision using a minimum of 10% duplicate samples, and we check spike recoveries between 80 and 120% for accuracy. And the thing that ties all of this together? The chain of custody. If you can't securely trace a sample from the exact moment it was pulled from a river to the moment it entered the lab analyzer, that data is legally indefensible. Period.
Which brings us to Session 3, Secondary Data Validation.
Because you usually only have one season of primary baseline data, secondary data provides that absolutely crucial historical context. But, and this is a big but, you can't just use any random data you pull off the internet. You have to rely on authentic, recent government sources. We're talking the Indian Meteorological Department for weather, the Central Groundwater Board for hydrology, the Forest Survey of India for ecology, the Census for demographics, and the Bureau of Indian Standards for seismicity. On top of that, good industry practice mandates that every single piece of secondary data is logged in a validation register, making sure you note its vintage and the specific expert who approved it.
And here's the thing. Active FAA cross-verification of this secondary data, that is a strict NABET mandate. It's not an optional step. A lot of times, consultants just fail to visit the site to ground truth their secondary data, which NABET considers a massive non-compliance issue. Think about it. If the CGW says groundwater is at 10 meters, but your site visit reveals dried up wells at 30 meters, you have to investigate that, document the discrepancy, and apply expert judgment. Doing that multi-source comparison and physical ground truthing is what ensures the scientific correctness of your entire assessment.
All right, let's wrap things up with Session 4, Practical Checklists.
Before the EIA coordinator signs off on the whole shebang, we apply a strict decision framework to determine data viability. Now, accepted data is pristine. It meets QA/QC limits, maintains an unbroken chain of custody, and relies on current instrument calibration. On the flip side, data is instantly rejected if there's significant blank contamination, expired equipment calibration, or just massive, unjustified outliers. And let's be clear, including rejected data doesn't just make your report look sloppy, it completely compromises the EIA and can literally lead to a consultant getting their accreditation totally revoked.
So, are you ready to defend your next EIA report? By implementing these rigorous data validation frameworks, you're transitioning from just drafting a generic report to engineering a scientifically defensible document. And that wraps up our explainer on the Day 1 Pivot training course curriculum. We've covered the history, why reports fail NABET review, and all the critical data validation steps. If you found this deep dive into environmental compliance valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Join us for our next explainer covering Day 2, where we're going to tackle the most common interpretation mistakes and some really cool interactive case studies. See you then.